What could make one of the most powerful, soulful women in rock and roll history, a woman who fought her way to the top with sheer, undeniable talent, smash a bottle of Southern comfort over the head of the Lizard King himself? Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison. On paper, they were twin flames of 1960s rebellion, two of the most electrifying forces to ever command a stage. But behind the velvet curtains and haze of psychedelic smoke, their one significant encounter wasn't some playful clash of rock egos. It was something far more charged. While hate might be a strong word, the incident cemented a disgust so profound that she refused to ever be in the same room with him again. Once you understand what really happened between them that night, the aggressive, humiliating moment that confirmed all of Joplin's worst fears about entitled men, you'll see why she viewed him as a figure she could never respect. This is the story of that night, and the deep, painful reason she refused to forgive him. To understand the explosion, you have to understand the elements. Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison weren't just singers. They were forces of nature, channeling the cultural shifts of the late 1960s. But they came from two totally different sides of that rebellion. First, there was Janis. Before she was a legend, she was a girl from Port Arthur, Texas, a conservative oil town that seemed determined to crush her spirit. Growing up, she was a classic outcast, overweight, suffering from painful acne, and bullied relentlessly for it. In her own words, "They laughed me out of class, out of town, out of the state." But that pain didn't break her. It forged her. It created a fierce defiance, a deep empathy for the underdog, and a visceral hatred for bullies. Music was her escape. She found her power in the raw voices of blues legends like Bessie Smith and Big Mama Thornton. When she finally made it to San Francisco, that pain became the fuel for her art. Her voice wasn't just powerful, it was authentic. When Janis screamed the blues, you believed her because she'd lived them. Her tough-talking, Southern comfort-swigging persona was armor, protecting a deeply sensitive woman who craved acceptance, but refused to change for anyone. She was fighting a war on two fronts, one for her place in music, and another against the entitled male ego. And then there was Jim Morrison. If Janis was forged in rejection, Jim was sculpted from rebellion. Born to a high-ranking authoritarian, Navy Admiral, Morrison's life was a performance of defiance. He was handsome, charismatic, and impossibly cool. He wasn't a true outcast, he was a self-styled one, a poet-shaman bringing literature and darkness to rock and roll. He was the electrifying Lizard King. But beneath the leather and poetic proclamations, a more troubling picture was emerging. Those who knew him described a man of dueling personalities. Sober, he could be quiet and erudite. But fueled by alcohol, his rebellion often tipped into chaos and cruelty. A reputation for erratic and sometimes aggressive behavior was growing, alienating his own bandmates and peers. His public image was a romantic rebel, but his private behavior often resembled that of a spoiled, belligerent man who used his fame to belittle those around him. So you have these two icons hurtling through the same cosmos. Janis, the queen of psychedelic soul, whose power came from earned authenticity, and Jim, the Lizard King, whose power was built on a constructed, often chaotic, persona. They were destined to collide. And the person who lit the fuse was their shared record producer, Paul Rothchild. Paul Rothchild was one of the most respected producers of the era, the sonic architect for The Doors and also the man working with Janis on her masterpiece, Pearl. In his mind, he had the king and queen of rock under his wing, and he cooked up what he thought was a brilliant idea. They had to meet. He arranged a party at his LA home specifically to get them in the same room, hoping for a legendary meeting of the minds. The evening reportedly started off well. Both Janis and Jim arrived, initially sober, and there was an immediate fascination. Morrison was captivated by Joplin's wild energy, and she was intrigued by his suave, intelligent side. For a moment, Rothschild's plan seemed to be working. They talked, they laughed. It looked like the start of a rock and roll alliance. But as the night wore on and the drinks flowed, the facade began to crumble. Specifically, Jim Morrison's. With each drink, the charming poet devolved into what Rothschild himself later called a cretin, a disgusting drunk. His behavior became rude, obnoxious, and aggressive. The intellectual connection soured into crude, unwanted advances toward Janis. For Joplin, This was an instant deal-breaker. This wasn't the brooding artist she'd been talking to. This was a character she knew all too well from the rough bars of her past, a belligerent drunk who couldn't take no for an answer. She had spent her life fighting men who felt entitled to her time and her body. She shot him down, turning away and making it clear she wasn't interested. But Jim Morrison didn't handle rejection well. Her dismissal seemed to egg him on. He became more persistent, his advances more physical. It wasn't playful anymore. It was harassment. The more she pulled away, the more he pushed, following her around the party. The atmosphere, once crackling with potential, was now thick with tension. This supposed icon of rebellion was acting like the exact kind of bully she'd spent her life fighting. The night was about to take a violent turn. Having had more than enough, Janice decided to leave. She found Paul Rothschild, the man who orchestrated this disastrous evening, and asked him for a ride home, a final attempt to escape a toxic situation. Rothschild agreed, and they headed for his car. But Jim Morrison wasn't finished. He saw them leaving and followed them out of the house, still drunk and refusing to take no for an answer. What happened next, according to most accounts, was the act that turned a bad night into an unforgivable offense. As Janice sat in the car, ready to leave, Morrison reached in and physically grabbed her by the hair. This was the ultimate violation. It was no longer verbal harassment. It was a physical, aggressive assertion of dominance. For a woman who had fought for autonomy and respect in a world that constantly tried to deny her both, this was an infuriating act. All the pain from Port Arthur, all the struggles for her identity, it all came rushing to the surface in a single moment of rage. Her reaction wasn't fear. It was instantaneous and decisive. She was a fighter. Without a moment's hesitation, Janis Joplin unleashed her fury. She grabbed the very object that was her trademark, a bottle of Southern Comfort. And with all the force of a woman who had finally had enough, she smashed it over Jim Morrison's head. The sound of shattering glass was followed by the sight of the Lizard King dropping to the ground, stunned and dazed. The scene was one of stunned chaos. Morrison was on the pavement, and Janice, filled with righteous anger, had physically defended herself against the man who assaulted her. Paul Rothschild was left in shock. His dream of uniting rock royalty had ended in a messy heap on the asphalt. Janis Joplin had made her point with a decisive, shattering blow. The party was officially over. This single, violent act would define their non-relationship forever. But what happened the next day is even more telling about who Jim Morrison was, and why Janis Joplin's feelings were not just a flash of anger, but a deeply held conviction. If you're finding this story fascinating, take a second to hit that subscribe button. We uncover the real stories behind the music every week. The night ended with Jim Morrison on the ground and Janis Joplin driving away. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, Morrison's reaction is the key to understanding why Janis's contempt for him became permanent. One might expect a person just hit with a bottle to be angry or embarrassed. According to producer Paul Rothschild, Jim Morrison was neither. He was fascinated. He woke up the next day not with a grudge, but with a strange admiration for the woman who had laid him out. He was reportedly enthralled by her fire, impressed that she had not only stood up to him, but had physically overpowered him. He immediately began asking Rothschild for Janis's phone number, desperate to see her again. But his newfound obsession was met with a wall of ice. When Janis was told that Morrison was looking for her, her response was absolute. She wanted nothing to do with him, ever again. She reportedly told her road manager to keep him away from her. Rothschild had to deliver the final message. Jim, Janis doesn't think it would be a good idea for you two to get together again. And they never did. He was crushed. This is the core of why she refused to forgive him. It wasn't just the physical assault. It was his reaction to it. His admiration for her violence disgusted her. He didn't see her rage as a legitimate response to his abusive behavior. He saw it as an interesting part of her personality, something that made her terrific in his eyes. He completely failed to understand that he had crossed a serious line. By being impressed, he revealed that he saw her authentic fury as just another part of the rock and roll spectacle, further objectifying her. For him, it was a game. For her, it was a fight for her dignity. This incident crystallized for Janis everything she despised about the double standards for men and women in rock. Jim Morrison was often celebrated for his chaos. His drunken antics and destructive behavior were romanticized as the torment of a tortured poet. Janis was never afforded such a luxury. When she was loud or emotional, she was seen as unstable or a mess. He was praised for being dangerous. She was punished for surviving. He assaulted her, and in his mind, it made her more attractive. For Janis, this wasn't just an insult, it was a profound invalidation. She drew a line that night, not just between herself and Jim Morrison, but between herself and the toxic culture that enabled and celebrated men like him. Janis Joplin's assessment of Jim Morrison's character wasn't an outlier. Her experience fit a well-documented pattern of behavior. Many of Morrison's peers shared a similar disdain for him, confirming that Janis's instincts were spot on. Lou Reed of the Velvet Underground reportedly had nothing but contempt for Morrison, viewing him as a pretentious drunk. He was said to have dismissed the news of Morrison's death with a cutting remark. Jerry Garcia of the Grateful Dead was also unimpressed, dismissing Morrison's stage persona as a poor imitation of Mick Jagger. Frank Zappa, a critic of the hype machine, condemned the deification of Morrison and found the marketing around the Doors to be distasteful. And after sharing a festival bill in 1969, Robert Plant of Led Zeppelin was reportedly appalled by Morrison's chaotic and antagonistic performance, calling the spectacle sickening to watch. These were critiques from his own contemporaries, but more disturbing accounts came from his treatment of women. The aggression towards Janis was apparently not unique. Allegations from former girlfriends paint a picture of a man who could be cruel. In recent years, his former girlfriend, Judy Huddleston, has described a traumatic sexual assault. The Doors' own drummer, John Densmore, has admitted to being terrified of Morrison at times, even witnessing him hold a knife to a woman. Then there was his public behavior. The most infamous example was the 1969 concert in Miami. Arriving late and heavily intoxicated, Morrison spent the night taunting the audience, turning the show into a near riot. This led to a warrant for his arrest on charges including indecent exposure and public profanity, a scandal that haunted the band. Taken together, this pattern of private and public turmoil validates Janis Joplin's judgment. She wasn't just reacting to a drunken pass. She recognized in Jim Morrison a deep-seated toxicity, a mix of arrogance and aggression disguised as poetic rebellion. She saw the danger in him when others were still blinded by the myth. The story of Janis Joplin and Jim Morrison is more than a wild rock anecdote. It's a collision of two different ideologies masked as similar rebellions. On one side stood Jim Morrison, the Lizard King, a man whose chaos was often romanticized and whose cruelty could be excused as the byproduct of a tortured artist. On the other side stood Janis Joplin. Her rebellion wasn't a performance. It was her existence, born from real pain and the fight to be respected as a woman in a man's world. When she smashed that bottle over Morrison's head, it was an act of self-defense, not just for her body, but for her dignity. Her refusal to engage with him afterward wasn't a petty grudge. It was a moral line in the sand. She couldn't respect him because his behavior, and the world's frequent adoration of it, represented the very double standard that haunted her. He was the entitled bully who gets a pass because of his talent. Janis saw him not as a poet, but as a symbol of the toxic culture she had been fighting her entire life. In the end, their tragic parallel paths both led them to the infamous 27 Club. But the story of their violent encounter reveals a deeper truth. Jim Morrison may have been called the king, but on that night, and in her unwavering refusal to forgive what he represented, Janis Joplin proved she was the one who was truly unbreakable. Two icons, two tragic endings. But in this story, who do you think was the true rebel? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories behind the music.